I didn't think a lot about this until last year, but I knew that my great-granddad drove cattle to Dodge City twice.
McAllister,
Yep.
James McAllister.
Yeah. So 2 times he drove cattle from Wallowa County to Dodge City. I hunted like an hour from Dodge City last year, and that was the first time that I thought about what that would have meant. It had to have taken longer than a year because you're not making it over the mountains except for in a relatively short period in the summer, and you're not going to drive those cattle all the way there in time to turn around and make it back before winter.
No.
What an ordeal.
Oh, my God, yeah. Yeah,
to
crazy.
take cattle to market.
Yeah, crazy.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, the crazy stuff. Yeah.
These are stories of outdoor adventure and expert advice from folks with calloused hands. I'm James Nash, and this is the Six Ranch Podcast. Four years ago, I bought a new truck for the first time ever, and I was so excited. It was incredible. It smelled good. It felt good. I wasn't constantly afraid of breaking down, It was awesome. But after I drove it for a couple weeks, I do the same thing that I always do, and the back seat started to fill up with stuff. I'm guiding elk hunters and deer hunters, and I'm duck hunting, and I'm fly fishing, and all that gear just accumulates. And pretty soon, I wasn't able to take people with me anymore, and I was embarrassed. People would ask for a ride, and like, no, sorry, man, I've got too much stuff with me. But I couldn't put it in the bed because then it gets damaged by weather. So I go to the internet, and I'm looking for options, and I ended up buying a deck-to-drawer system. Now, this was a big purchase for me, but it's something that I felt like I needed, and it looked like it was going to be a good product, and it really was. Decked came out with a new drawer system this year, and they've made some meaningful improvements over the previous one. You have almost no wasted space in your truck bed now, so you can access the sides of the drawers, and then the drawers roll a full 18 inches farther out, so you can actually access the back of the drawer even if you don't have a lot of arm reach. There's some really strong tie-down points on top that have a 400-pound load rating, so if you're going to haul something like a motorcycle or big coolers or whatever, you can really strap your gear down and make it secure. You can lock these drawer systems, so you can lock the drawers, or if your tailgate locks, then nobody can access the drawers anyways. So I actually feel like my stuff is more secure inside this drawer system than in the cab of my truck. That's a big deal to me. The complete deck system is made in America by Americans, and that that's something that I love and appreciate. They've got one that will fit in any truck or van that's been made in America in the last 20 years plus. You can go to decked.com/sixranch and get free shipping. But just being honest with you, they give free shipping to everybody. I also, while you're there, want you to check out their deco line. So they've got a bunch of different boxes and storage containers that either fit on top of or inside of the drawer system, and those are built really robust. I saw the prototypes at an event this summer. I'm impressed. I'm excited to get my hands on them. I haven't yet, but the prototypes were super badass, and the ones that are in production model, they're available now over at decked.com. So even if you just need a place for some tools, or you need a new bow case, or something along those lines, go check that out. And if you're driving around right now and your back seat is just full of gear and you can't haul people around, maybe you should consider looking at the full deck drawer system, because it's a good piece of gear. It was a good purchase for me, and I hope it helps you. I think history almost has to start with a question, don't you?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your question?
I mean, I think my initial question was, in general terms, was what was the relationship like between the settlers, the first settlers and that gang, and the native folk was kind of my first question. What was that really like?
Right.
And,
you hear you hear people say different things that are difficult, if not impossible, to substantiate, but there's also a bunch of social pressure around this topic that's growing increasingly, which is who has rightful claim to the land. I think is maybe one of those fundamental questions, and there is this growing feeling that we need to give it back to the tribes. That comes with all sorts of complications and isn't really the subject that we're going to get into. But I know there's been incidents where I've talked at seminars, or my mom has talked at different seminars or conventions about the Six Ranch, about Wallowa County, about generational ranching. And anytime it's, say, in Portland, for example, somebody is going to say, well, how do you feel about your family taking part in genocide and living, on bloody soil? Like, well, that isn't really the case. But because there is so much pressure around that, people tend to develop stories that aren't necessarily history. Would you say that that's a fair assessment?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, it's more complicated.
So much more complicated
than an easy soundbite is going to get you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. So we were founded in 1884. The county was founded in what year?
87.
87.
Yeah.
Okay. And Oregon was founded in 1859. But at that time, Oregon was a lot larger than what it is now. So how big was the Oregon territory? Do you recall that?
Off the top of my head, it was pretty sizable, though. It was including a lot. Of course, they carved Washington off of it.
Yeah.
And Idaho. So, yeah, pretty sizable chunk of ground.
I think the Oregon territory included Montana at one time.
That's probably right.
Yeah.
I'm sure it did. It was a big old chunk of ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huge piece of ground.
Yeah.
Have you ever looked into where the name Oregon comes from?
A little bit. There's always kind of some argument about I think they give you a couple different options where it potentially came from. It's kind of escaping my memory now.
Yeah.
Where that did come from.
As far as I can tell, because I got sold a dummy a bunch of times growing up asking this question. They're like, oh, it's Spanish. Like that was the default.
Yeah.
Like, okay, well, when I look this up in Spanish, there's not a word for it.
Right.
So
no.
That doesn't sound right. As far as I can tell, Oregon was the name of a river that doesn't exist. Like that was the name of the Inland Passage River. And after we discovered that there wasn't a river that somehow magically flows coast to coast, then the name stuck, but there was no river to stick it to.
Okay, yeah. Right. Yeah, okay, I vaguely recall that.
Yeah.
Kind of the same thing with Idaho. Like, where did that word come from? And you'll see various things on, people saying here came from here or there, but yeah.
What's your take on Idaho? I haven't looked into that one at all.
Now that's escaping me too. I remember kind of delving into that, but it's been a while back exactly where that word came from. But it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any definitive answer,
right?
Of where it came from. Some people say it means gem of the mountains or something like that.
Yeah.
But, once you kind of delve into it, it doesn't sound like that's the case.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
But
so where did your question lead you?
I think I went into it, I wasn't setting out to prove one thing or another thing. I didn't really care. I just wanted to know what it was.
Yeah.
As a sidelight of that I was interested into, not only their relationship, the settlers and the native folk, but, what was their relationship with the place, the water, the animals, the rocks, the grass, looking at both sort of views. And so, the approach I took was just to read every single thing I could, and I'm still doing that because there's a lot out there. But, that including hours on the old microfiche reader in the library, just reading newspaper page by newspaper page, which is a fun, depending on your viewpoint.
I bet it's fascinating.
It is because, you just start to get the flavor of the time, and it starts to even affect how you talk and how you think, because you're reading in that language, which is a little bit different style, and you pick up words and expressions that you wouldn't normally, and so but just diving into all those original sources as much as I could, and I think what showed me is, like you were saying, it's more complicated than you would think.
And it's such a reading those period pieces is such a portal into what was going on. It's fascinating. This is a different scale, but had a little Veterans Day party over here the other day, and Lyle Witherite, who's been on the show a couple times, Lyle showed up with a 50-year-old Playboy. And we thumbed through that thing, and the advertisements were so interesting. Interesting. Not only in like the products, like what was cutting edge of technology at that time or whatever, but just the style of advertising and the type of personality that they're playing to. It says a lot about who people are at any given time.
Totally.
So one thing that happened here, and I think it happened in a lot of places, is newspapers got used for insulation in walls a lot. And some of these old buildings, if they start to come down a little bit, you can find newspapers wadded up and layered in the walls. And I always think that that's just such a treasure, because you can look and see what the price of pork was in 1903. Really interesting. Our newspaper started here pretty early too, didn't it?
May 84, as far as Wallowa County. The Chieftain you started up in Joseph May, first edition.
That's an old newspaper, isn't it? That's a pretty old newspaper, isn't it?
For sure. And then locally, like in the Grand Round Valley, they started in 68.
Okay.
So quite a bit before. But in terms of the Chieftain, it's kind of sad, because we're looking at that early period through the 1880s and even into the 90s. You really have got a handful of papers, maybe 20 odd. And it's a shame that we don't have all of them, because we're just missing some of those years. There's only a couple, and in a lot of cases, and on some years there's no known papers, so we're dependent on somebody finding one in an attic or stuffed in a wall or something like that.
So what did you find out? What was the relationship like between the early settlers and the Chief Joseph Band of the Nez Perce?
Well, it's one of those things, as soon as you say something, you're almost going to be telling a lie. You know what I mean? Because, like you're talking about, of course, attitudes changed over time. If you picked a year, let's say you said, okay, what was their attitude in 1872? And you're going to look at that specific year. And then you're looking at as many original sources of people from that time period. So I guess my view is, you can see that not only attitudes changed over the years, but people's individual attitudes would change over a lifetime, or even part of a lifetime, So depending on the context of what was exactly going on in Wallowa County at that time and what that person's personal thing was. So what you see, I think, in general, is you kind of see a continuum of attitudes, let's call it attitudes, or belief systems around, native folk. And like on one end of the continuum, you could say, if you're just putting an abstract thing out there, you could see, there's folks that are on the genocide end of things at some point, at maybe a specific point.
Right.
That's the far end. And then the other end, might be like, live and let live, that's a little rarer.
Yeah.
But I think most people generally fall into the middle ground category on a continuum, where they're like, we want to respect the rights of the native folk and all that. But on the other hand, their way of living is outmoded it's something from a bygone era, and it needs to change. They need to get with the program. You know what I mean?
Right.
Adopt Christianity and modern techniques of living on the land and all those things, and that traditional life way of here in the county, coming up in the valley and the mountains for the summer and then going back for the winter, that's out of step with where progress is heading. So they just need to get with the program and change,
right,
and become more like, Europeans. So I think a lot of those folks, they didn't have ill will towards native folks, but they did have that general viewpoint that, and I would roughly call that, so you got like at one end, you got this concept of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And, white supremacy is kind of, it's what, at least in my mind, the definition, if you think about that, you're willing to use violence to maintain white folks at the top of the pyramid. And then there's a more gentler version of it, which is just white superiority.
Okay.
And just that, I think a lot of people fell in that, because if you, for instance, you're coming from a culture that is building, say, guns.
Right.
That's a complicated process, from mining the ore to, smelting it and going through that whole process and then making the individual components and putting that machine together. So if you are from that time period and you're just looking like, obviously, we are superior. Look at these things we're,
right.
Look at these things we're doing and what we built and
the technological innovations, medical innovations.
Totally. So, I mean, they're resting a lot of their sense of themselves as a superior culture on that. Mm-hmm. And of course, the other was, most of those folks had not all of them, but a good portion of pretty strong Christian beliefs. And they're coming from the viewpoint that, native spirituality is nonsense.
Right.
And that Christianity is the true path.
Yeah.
And so they're coming also from that perspective. And so, and then just in terms of living on the land, they're also come from the perspective that this just wandering through the countryside and going from, say, camas ground to bighorn sheep ground to, and then back down into the canyons, that sort of lifestyle where you're moving through the countryside is, that's like what barbarians do.
Right.
And so all of that package, I think, led them to the conclusion that, we got a superior culture.
Gotcha. Yeah. Interesting. And then there's also the competition over space and resources. Nez Perce had a lot of cattle and horses.
Oh, yeah.
Thousands.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I've conjectured about this. Maybe my guess is that the cattle they ran were Corianis.
Yeah.
I don't know what else they could be.
Yeah. I have never delved in that, but that's really interesting, what kind of cattle they had. I know that, reading some of the newspapers, in the Grand Round Valley, of course, they'd be, there was at some point where some folks, and this is pretty early, started bringing in like purebred Hereford. Mm-hmm. And those were worth more, and you had these other longhorn cattle that, so they were looking at breeding purebred cattle and introducing different versions. But I've never known exactly what kind of cattle, the Wallowa Band had.
I would expect that they were, probably not a Texas Longhorn, which don't handle the cold all that well.
Right.
But the Coriani makes a lot of sense. That's what the Spanish brought over. I think that getting cattle and horses from a similar vein is likely.
I bet you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, I know they, like as the Oregon Trail was cutting through the Grand Round Valley and over Umatilla Way, Whitman Mission and all that, they were trading, trading oxen, trading horses, trading cattle.
Right.
But
yeah, and so many people grew up playing the game Oregon Trail.
Oh yeah.
They've got a relative sense of familiarity with that, and I love that. I mean, it's all over the world. Oregon Trail is.
Yeah.
Oxen is not a type of cow. It's a job that a cow has.
Yeah.
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 So there are breeds that lend themselves to it, but it's similar to saying like draft horses.
Right.
Like that this is a category of horses, and really it's like how you're using the animal. So you can think of oxen as like beast of burden,
Yeah.
something that can do some
Yeah.
work. But gosh, what an incredible thing. I've never seen anybody use a cow or a steer for that type of work.
No.
You know, that technology died so long ago. It really didn't carry on.
Yeah.
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 But can you imagine trying to get cattle to pull you across the prairie and the plains?
No. In fact, I think they were basically a different species from us, because
Yeah.
I'm like, it's hard to, and a lot of those folks were, they started off with a pair of shoes, and midway through they don't got a pair of shoes.
Right.
And there's not a store to pick up an extra pair.
No.
So they ended up just greasing their feet,
Yeah.
to put up with it. But it's mind-bending.
Brutal.
Yeah.
And the number of graves that are along the Oregon Trail.
Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't it like every 50 yards or something?
Yeah.
If you were to spread it out.
Crazy
like
amount of people. Yeah.
Phenomenal how hard that was.
Yeah.
How hard that was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think you're hitting on, on the Nez Perce cattle and horses, it's, all the other stuff, it was about the land.
Mm-hmm.
That bottom line, whether people are coming in with arguments of why the settlers should have the land as opposed to, say, the Nez Perce.
Right.
They're using racism as one lens
Mm-hmm.
as part of the argument, but basically, it's about the land. It's about, having access to the land, because you're talking, initially here, the big push was grass.
Right.
Grass, because you got all this great bunch grass, north of the valley, acres and acres and acres of epic bunch grass. And that's, all you had to do
valuable.
Is, run a herd out there and, let them do their thing and gather them up. And
yeah. And they can winter on it.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I'm curious what the livestock situation looked like. Were those horses kept relatively close to camp so that they could access them? For sure they would have to protect them from getting stolen by other tribes. But a couple thousand head of horses eats a pile of food, and they eat it down to their rocks.
Yeah.
So if you're a settler and you come out here and, you make your claim and this is your, 640 acres or whatever, and then a couple thousand head of Nez Perce horses come through and eat every blade of grass on your place.
Oh,
that can build resentment really quickly.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
And that's probably why those attitudes were shifting so much. It's like, well, as long as it's not affecting me or mine, like you do your thing, I'll do mine, we'll get along. And, then something happens, there's a conflict. And it's like, well, somebody's got to do something about this.
That's it.
And then it escalates. And
that's it.
Yeah.
That's 100% it. Because if you think about it, early on in Oregon, of course, you could get a full square mile.
Mm-hmm.
But, later on when they were settled in this valley, you were neck down to 160 acres.
Yeah.
And if you think about 160 acres, by the time you put you throw up your cabin on it, and, then you put your outbuildings, and then you got your house garden, and you're starting to take up quite a bit of that 160.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you're going to probably put in some oats to feed, just for the winter time. And then you also got to have a little bit of hay ground. And so, it doesn't take long. 160, all of a sudden, in terms of subsistence, it's not very much. And in terms of making a profit, it ain't very much at all. So the settlers were really dependent on the unclaimed land to graze on. Mm-hmm. So that's where a lot of the conflict came in, because, of course, every year that the Nez Perce would return to the valley, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 77, every summer that they'd come back in, there'd be more folks here, more land claimed. But the settlers, of course, were dependent on that open range for range.
Yep.
That wasn't, most of that wasn't happening on their 160.
Right.
Don't get me wrong, some of it, but they wanted a piece that abutted open range so that they could, and they sort of made gentlemen's agreements between each other, like, okay, you generally kind of take that area for your cattle, but every time a new settler came in, then they'd run into a bit of conflict when someone's kind of another settler is bumping up against where you had traditionally been grazing yours. And we see that later in the county when the north end started to be settled, Flora, Paradise, out that way. You really see this conflict not just between the Nez Perce, but also settler to settler.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You know, the folks say out at Paradise, and you can see they put together petitions complaining about the folks in Enterprise running cattle, taking their cattle from here out on the north end to graze in the summer.
Gotcha.
And so the guy or the family that's got 160 out there is like, what the hell? You know?
Yeah.
So they, you know, there was barn burnings and, you know, all kinds of that sort of stuff, settler to settler going on over that. But then also here comes the Nez Perce in the summer, running cattle and horses out that way, you know, on public land.
Yeah.
Right? So that conflict was going on. Yeah.
Which those conflicts continue to this day.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
And in fact, it wasn't all that long ago, just a few years ago, that out north in this same area we're talking about, one guy was driving some cattle through another guy's place, and it turned into a gunfight. And it's still happening.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, these resources and the contest over them continues to be a tremendous catalyst for conflict.
Yeah.
And
so basically you get, I mean, just down at the bottom of all that is making a living.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Let's talk about that a little bit, because we got into that yesterday, but a settler has to survive foremost.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then where does it go from there?
Yeah.
What does survival look like in this time frame, like late 1800s for those folks to come out here, and then how do they build from that?
Yeah. You know, it's a tough one because you read the accounts, and again, I go back to the like, holy shit, wow. The amount of labor and work we're talking about is really mind-bending.
Yeah.
From cutting poles to build, you know, split rail fences, all of it. It's epic. But, you know, none of them were 100% subsistence. In other words, I mean, I think that was a very rare thing. I'm not, you know, if you look at those early settlers, they moved time after time after time, you know, so we always think of this idea that they left Iowa, say, and they came out here and they one and done. Mm-hmm. But no, what you typically see is that most of them, I would say all of them, they came in leaps and bounds, and they would claim a piece, you know, here, there, and there. They would improve that piece, meaning they'd build structures, barns, houses, etc., fence it, cultivate some land, and then they'd sell that. They'd take that profit that they made and move to a better place, and do that. God, a lot of them, you know, as many as a half dozen times. You'll see a lot of these settlers originally went to the Willamette Valley, and they may have hopped around 1, 2, 3, 4 times in the Willamette Valley, or in Kansas, say, or, you know, other places along the way, and again took that profit from doing the work, basically like you and I would think of, like, we bought a junky old house in downtown Lost Team, we put the work in, we renovate it, and we sold it at a profit, use that profit, turn around and buy another place.
Makes so much sense.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. So they were definitely doing that, but in terms of,
wow, I'd never considered that before.
Yeah. You know, that you just look at their leapfrogging that they were doing, and but you know, that was because that product, the land and then the labor and improvements you put into it, was a guarantee. You know, that was a guarantee for them, and so that was a way to make a profit so that they could move on. But these folks out here, you know, in terms of, like, if you think about those folks settling out just in that north end, you're out there. You think about Lost Prairie or some of those places, you're out there a ways. You know, you got the choice to go to Lewiston or come back to Enterprise.
Tough sledding either way, though, especially if it's wintertime.
Yep. Yeah. So they would spend, you know, especially on that initial year, they had taken their bankroll, say, to supply them through that first year or so. So that they brought in flour, sugar, coffee, some other things to help them through while they're improving that, so that they can do the work to say produce a product that they can in turn sell, whether that's cattle or horses or oats or whatever. Some of that stuff is just pure subsistence, but their main goal was to come up with some way to make a profit so they could put shoes on the kids, send them to school, because, most of those schools were subscription. Public schools didn't come till a bit later. Whatever it might be, a new gun, bullets,
right.
Stuff that they needed. So they were always keeping that in mind. Most of them would leave home and head over to places that were more established, Walla Walla in particular, and Grand Round Valley, and then get in on the grain harvest and make a little money that way, and then buy additional supplies while they were working to be able to produce their own, a commodity that they could sell. Of course, Wallowa County was really hard to do that, because let's say you produce a bunch of grain, you got to get it out of this hole to a market, and that was the thing that really killed them.
Continues
in terms of,
to.
I mean, the smartest thing to do was something that could walk.
Yeah.
So that was the cattle, horses, and pigs. In our case,
exactly,
they could get them out of here that way. But or sheep, of course. But
I didn't think a lot about this until last year, but I knew that my great granddad drove cattle to Dodge City twice.
McAllister, James McAllister.
Yeah. So 2 times he drove cattle from Wallowa County to Dodge City. I hunted like an hour from Dodge City last year, and that was the first time that I thought about what that would have meant. It had to have taken longer than a year, because you're not making it over the mountains except for in a relatively short period in the summer, and you're not going to drive those cattle all the way there in time to turn around and make it back before winter.
No.
What an ordeal.
Oh, my God, yeah. Yeah,
crazy.
To
take cattle to market.
Yeah, crazy.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, the crazy stuff. Yeah.
I fuss a little bit about, taking, like when Dad was running in big sheep, it'd take a while to, it'd take months to gather cattle.
Oh, yeah.
If we've got to gather everything up here and get it on trucks, it's labor, I'm like, I wish I was doing something else maybe. But if I was like, all right, time to take cattle to market, I'll see you in 2026, I hope,
Yeah, I hope. Yeah, there's no guarantee you're coming back. No.
Yeah, hopefully I come back, and hopefully I have a little bit of money with me.
Mm-hmm.
My goodness.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I also like to imagine the hog drives that they did to get them to Elgin, right?
Yeah.
Grazing them on crickets?
Yeah. I've got a little experience with hogs, but not much. But I've never driven.
Horses don't like them.
400 pigs.
Horses don't like them.
No.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy.
I think most of the horses I've been on have the same reaction to pigs as they do to bears.
Yeah.
They have a really strong, like scary, violent reaction to them. I'm sure you'd get used to that, but trying to drive pigs over canyons and across rivers.
Yeah. I don't even know.
And keep them fat the whole way.
Yeah.
These were tough people.
Oh, man. They were definitely tough people.
They were tough people.
Yeah.
Any standout individuals?
Oh, my gosh. I mean, there's so many interesting characters, from here. Like James McAllister is a really interesting character. Just his accounts of rolling in here as pretty young.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot his exact age, but he was just a teenager.
Right.
Coming in with his stepdad, and looking the county over, and how excited he was to get a chance and that to go on the trip. I think the first go around he didn't make the cut. The second one he did. He got to come in with if I remember right, Haley was his stepfather. Is that right?
Sounds right.
Halleck, but. Yeah. And I think one thing you get from his accounts is, working on the farm day in and day out as a young man, not that exciting.
Yeah.
So the chance to roll over here and, because there was Indians here,
Right.
there was native folk here, and he wanted to go bear hunting, he wanted to go deer hunting, and so just that chance, and to also catch a few salmon out of the lake and the river. So he was super excited to, uh, get out of the drudgery of farm work. And if you spent much time on a farm, and you know how it is, it's 24/7, and there's not a whole lot of excitement day to day on the farming front, but you get a chance to go into the wilderness, and but he's an interesting guy.
And and I'm named after him, and with names kind of skip generations, but it was James W. And then his grandson was James McAllister, my mom's dad, and that's what I get to carry. But yeah, they were very interesting men, and God bless them for keeping journals.
Yeah.
What an incredible thing to have now. And I remember that journal entry about him catching some trout here, killing a bear, cooking the trout in the bear fat, and deciding that that's where he was going to live.
Yeah.
I think about that every time I fish and hunt here.
Yeah.
Like how those feelings can transcend generations and centuries is really interesting to me.
It is.
Yeah. It feels good.
Yeah.
So the Nez Perce left in 1877. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the fun things about history is learning like which domino fell first and kind of why something happened later on. But if we wind it back a little bit, the last week of June of 1876 was the Little Bighorn. And then the day that news got to Washington, D.C. was July 4th, 1876. So on our 100-year birthday, the Americans learned of this defeat. And I think that really changed attitudes in, what were starting to become the later years of the Indian Wars. And that probably escalated tensions here as well. Would you agree with that?
Oh, for sure. Because again, the local newspapers were carrying all that news.
Mm-hmm.
And so those things, were in the minds of the public, and it definitely did, 100%. Like you're saying, if you think you're just going to study Wallowa County history without setting it in the larger context, you're going to miss.
Right.
You're going to miss the big picture. You really, because Grand Round Valley was settled right at the start of the Civil War. The big rush into the heart of the Nez Perce territory for gold strikes, same time period.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't see that, you're not looking at that. You're not going to really understand a lot of what was going on. Same thing with the Modoc War. Really changed political opinions and approaches to white settler conflicts, and changed minds about what's the best way to go. Same thing with Little Bighorn. Just blew people's minds that that happened.
Yeah. I'm unfamiliar with the Modoc War.
In that, the 72, 73, 74, the Modocs trying to hold on to their piece on that sort of California-Oregon line down there in southern Oregon, and, trying to herd them onto the Klamath Reservation, which was established by that point, who were their enemies. And so them basically trying to hold on to what they had, and a similar sort of thing, because once they got into the lava beds down there in that part of Northern California, South Klamath Falls, pretty hard to get them out of there, and they had real success against U.S. Army.
Yeah.
And so that was a mind bender to folks, in terms of like, oh, wait a minute. And it caused a big wave of anxiety all across the Pacific Northwest, because then people from Washington Territory, Idaho Territory, Oregon were, convinced that there was going to be uprisings by the Yakima, the Nez Perce, everywhere they saw an uprising. So they were living sort of on edge, because they were reading those daily reports, which went on for quite a while as that Modoc War was going on.
Hmm.
And then you like in a context like that, you'll see people really, since their anxiety is way elevated, they start advocating for full-on genocide.
Right.
And then once they get through those crisis points, then you'll see sort of that genocide stuff kind of die down a little bit and a little more reasonable approach to what they think is the solution to this conflict. But yeah.
Lava, that would be a place that I would love to defend and hate to attack.
Yeah.
Today, with anything.
Yeah.
Like that's a really lovely place to be able to maneuver and hide and defend.
Yeah.
And as far as assaulting it, if you're doing it on foot, if you're doing it on horse, if you're doing it with Abrams main battle tanks, it's going to be really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lava tubes. And of course, that stuff is so rugged, you can't even get a horse through it.
Right.
I mean, you're going to tear your horse up to nut. You just can't.
Totally.
It's cracks. And yeah. So they were pretty dug in. And and I think it made folks think, oh, what's going on here? We've had so many successes fighting Indians and winning always that things like that really change folks' mind. But
yeah. Okay. So we move forward to 1877. My understanding is that Chief Joseph was in Innisotan or Lewiston working on treaty amendments about the time that the Battle of White Bird happened. Do you know much of this story?
I mean, a little bit. And here's what I think I know. And you're always going to get. There's a lot of history. You're always going to get the limits. You're always going to get on thin ice in a particular area. But my understanding was that when that first round of killings happened, that they were processing Joseph, and several folks with him they had killed some cows, and they were processing cows somewhere down on the Snake or in the salmon.
This would have been on the salmon.
Yeah, on the salmon. And so when they got word, they were like, oh, uh-oh. They knew it wasn't going to be good.
Yeah.
But they were essentially preparing to go on the reservation. Okay. Not happy about it, but we're going to go on the reservation.
And that would have been the Lapwai Reservation.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And there was a guy named Elliot West, and he's written a couple books on American expansion. I think he recently wrote one on the Nez Perce called like The Last Indian War or something like that. I haven't read it yet. He was just on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he was talking about the Nez Perce leaving, and it was so evident to me that he's never been here.
Yeah.
Right? Because he didn't understand why they were fighting so hard to stay. He didn't understand why settlers wanted the land so bad, or why the U.S. government on their behalf wanted the land so badly. Like, dude, if you ever just came here, you would look at it for a second and realize all this.
Yeah.
And then he talked about the Nez Perce going over the Snake River as they left, which was in the springtime at high water, and it was at Doug Bar. Okay, everybody that talks about this who hasn't been there talks about this like it's this raging whitewater torrent, which the Snake River is in places. But at Doug Bar, where they crossed, that is a very, very easy place to cross. Like, you can be bad at swimming and you can cross the river right there. There's big eddies on both sides. It was very smart. I'm sure that they'd crossed there many times throughout history.
Oh, yeah.
That was probably a known trail.
And depending on the exact moment in any given spring, right, it just depends on the weather conditions, right? That river will come up and go down dramatically over just a few short days.
But right there, even if it's 100,000 CFS, it's still slow. Yeah. It's just big and slow right there.
Yeah.
If there was a bunch of logs coming down, that could be a problem. But yeah. And I do think it's interesting that they crossed most of the people in bull boats.
Yeah.
That'd be tough.
Yeah.
They must have brought the lumber with them.
I think they were, well, you read different things, but some of those buffalo hide boats with, woven interiors or, but those were basically round and pretty tricky to, to paddle, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
But,
I'd want a little ballast in the bottom of it, I think.
Yeah.
But pretty amazing. And then, the Battle of Whitebird. So that shifted, and we say the Battle of Whitebird, but it was more of a skirmish than anything else. Just some dudes shooting at each other in the rocks.
Yeah.
And what wasn't a battle the way people, I think, probably imagine battles being. But then it turns into, this entire tribe and all of their goods and all of their people and their livestock fleeing across this really difficult country.
Yeah.
Do you know, and I don't know much about the Battle of the Big Hole, the next engagement?
I mean, I guess, I've read, of course, those accounts, whether it was Yellow Wolf's account and those things, coming right from the source, and a lot of the research that McWhorter had did on those battles. I mean, the one thing that, that sticks out for me, because there's a person in that battle that is a personal hero of mine, and that's Peopeo Talikt. I'm probably, wrecking the translation of his name, but later in life they called him Little Joseph. But in that particular battle, he was one of the ones that captured the howitzer, dismantled it, buried it, and himself was shot and survived that that particular battle, and then of course was made that long journey down to Oklahoma and back up, and eventually ended up on the Lapaway. But he went back with young Joseph to Washington D.C. at least twice, and I'm going to get this wrong, but I think he died in 36, 7, 8, somewhere in there. But he kept up trying to get land back on the Wallowa, clear up to his death.
Yeah.
And he was when A.C. Smith started to build the road in June 72 from the Grand Round into the Wallowa Valley. He was, according to A.C. Smith, who gave an interview in 1910 shortly before he died, that was Peopeo, who rode up with some other Wallowa Band Nez Perce and said, "Hey, no, stop building this road right now."
Yeah.
And they'd warned him, if you're still building it when we come back, you're in big trouble.
Right.
But of course, the road building went on. But yeah,
was that about the same time as the Chief Joseph deadline?
Yeah. So
I think that's a great story. Tell me that story.
Yeah. Well, old Joseph. There's been several things written about this, but it's particularly like, when did old Joseph build these monuments marking their territory? My guess is that they did it in 1866, because 66 was the first survey into Wallowa County, and all they were doing was extending the baseline, which is, so you've got an axis, you got the meridian and the baseline, which the center of the axis is Portland, and the West Hills up there. So, like, they extended the baseline into Grand Round Valley in 64, up at the head of one of the forks of Clark Creek, and then in 66 they were going to extend it into the Wallowa Valley, because by that time, the Treaty of 63, they'd carved the Nez Perce Reservation down to 90% of its former size, so that opened the Wallowa Valley. So, but the first step is you got to get that baseline in there, so you got something to survey off of. And so they came charging in, William Odell and some other folks actually from the Grand Round Valley, who he hired on to help. They surveyed the line in over to the edge of Zumwalt, just up above Little Sheep, and stopped there, because they were like, "Oh, there's a lot more to extend it onto the Snake." So they did a little poking around. And
looks kind of steep, boss.
Yeah. And so they had come on that line. If you think about it, they had just up basically east of Somerville and a little southish of Elgin, from Clark's Creek over across the top, and then down into the Minam, back up out of the Minam, and then down into Big Canyon and Deer Creek, back up that side, and then down into Bear Creek and back up that side, and then across the top. And they came out about right where between Wallowa and Lost Teen there, where posts have their mechanic shop there.
Yeah.
And then shot across through the valley, and then the line goes just a hair north of Enterprise and on back across the way. But as they were coming back, they had surveyed that line, and they had, part of the survey instructions was, you're marking the edges of each section and the center of each section, and you've got to put a post and a rock pile and a pit at the corner of each section, and then in the center you've got to put a stake, a post. And so they had a pretty good line of posts and stakes and rock piles going through that way. And then on their way back, they ran into Old Joseph. It's disputed whether it was on the Lost Teen or the Wallowa, but they met them fishing there. And Old Joseph, the only way they had to communicate was through Chinook, Chinook Wawa, the jargon. Basically, it's a language of 500-600 words at best.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's a mix of Russian and Spanish and Chinook and French and English, all in kind of a, what would you call it? Just a jargon.
Yeah, pigeon.
So you're not going to talk philosophy in that language,
right.
But you can communicate. But Old Joseph and several of them in the survey party spoke Chinook, Wawa, and so they could communicate. But the Nez Perce and Old Joseph let them know that no, they knew what they were up to. They weren't. It wasn't like they didn't understand what these posts meant. They knew full well what they meant. So when they came back, they noticed that most of them had been torn down, and that Old Joseph told them, no.
Yeah.
This is not yours, and you're not surveying it. If you come back, he let them know that they'd be in big trouble.
Yeah.
So following that, this is my opinion, because no one knows exactly when he built them.
And not to eschew euphemisms, big trouble means we're going to kill you.
That's
right?
exactly what.
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, he used the word mamuk, which in Chinook means kill.
Yeah.
Yeah, we will kill you.
Yeah.
That's the word that they quoted. And it was actually, yeah. So my guess is that following that event, they went up and they established the boundary markers in the one single place, and they knew where the settlers were going to come from, that they were going to come from the Grand Ram Valley, because they'd already been sneaking cattle in, and they'd already had mining parties coming in. So they knew which way they were going to come. And the Nez Perce Trail basically went right up Fish Trap, outside of Elgin, went across Cricket Flat, and then dove off the hill right there at Minam Summit. There was already a well-established trail.
Right.
Big trail. Because like you said, they were bringing...
road, basically, because they're dragging travois on it, so there would have been 2 drag marks.
100%.
Yeah.
And the way they described a lot of those trails is you would see this braided of a half dozen or more trails, kind of all woven together, where you're bringing big herds of horses and cattle, on a fairly regular basis. So A.C. Smith, of course, when he started figuring out a way into the valley, and the settlers who were pushing cattle over here early just to get some grazing, because the competition then in the Grand Ram Valley was intense for free grazing ground.
Yep.
So they were like, let's take our chances. You had to have a pretty big set of balls to come over to Wallowa County, because they knew there was a possibility of running into trouble. But
yeah,
still,
you might get mammoothed by old Chief Joseph.
Still, but a lot of, and then most of these were younger guys who were driving their cattle over.
Sure.
Most of them were bachelor, unmarried guys. So they're willing to take the chance. But so it was clear to the Nez Perce exactly the way that the settlers were going to come when they were going to come. And so right where you drop off Minam Summit there, they, on the sides of the trail, they mimicked these boundary markers. They're a pile of stone with a post in the center, and according to a couple accounts, painted red with some markings on them. But that idea was not new. The Cayuse and Nez Perce had already done the same thing in the Grand Round Valley.
Okay.
They they built a line of posts, basically, as the Grand Round River starts to head into Indian Valley. It goes through that tight, narrow, rocky gorge. Just on the Somerville side, they built a line there, in 1862. So they were already trying to establish their boundaries using the same technique that they had seen done time and time again all over the Pacific Northwest. So they knew what it meant.
Which is a version of assimilating to an extent. It's like, okay, if this is the language that you're going to use to show, where a boundary is, then I'll use the same language to show where my boundary is.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it was called the Chief Joseph Deadline. I love that story so much. I think it's fascinating. It shows a lot of character. Yeah. Honestly. Yeah. And creativity and adaptability. It's really, really interesting to me. The closest thing, I guess I've been around a few tribal cultures in the world. The most I've interacted with were tribes in Afghanistan, and it was never really actually clear to me, but you could tell by how buildings were constructed and how they farmed specific crops, and then the barricades around their compounds. They varied really significantly from one tribe to the next. So you could tell when you crossed a tribal boundary. It wasn't necessarily like you could look at somebody and tell that they were from this tribe or that. But that was very interesting. We even saw Alexandrian architecture in Afghanistan.
That's amazing.
That was just in ruins.
Yeah.
And nobody living in it. But it's like, oh my gosh, Alexander the Great made the same dumb mistake that I'm making right now.
Well, and a lot of people, a lot of different cultures.
Everybody's got to try at some point.
Yeah. And I never got the chance. I mean, I tried with a friend, tried to cross Pakistani border into Afghanistan, and didn't make. They wouldn't let us through. But then we went back to Islamabad, and we're waiting on a chance to fly up north to visit some of the tribal groups up in northern Pakistan. But could not get a window on the flights. It just socked in, week after week. I think we spent a couple weeks there in Islamabad trying to make a flight and never could get up there.
And if you get farther south, I've talked about this before, but they don't even consider themselves Afghans. They consider themselves Pashtuns, which is what the first letter of Pakistan stands for, is Pashtun. So on the news, CNN will talk about fighters crossing the Afghan-Pakistan border, but to them, it's like, no, actually, I live in Pashtunistan, and I'm Pashtun, and I'm walking in my own land. So this conflict of different peoples putting borders on each other, that's old too. That's something that we've been doing for a long time and will continue to do, and it never works out. It never works out for somebody, at least. But
your point, it's way, you haven't been there and on the ground, it's way more complicated. Like you're saying that, if you're just, you're back in the States and you're doing your thing and the war's going on over there, but you're understanding, like you said about the guy who wrote the book, but he'd never been in and looked at the geography and what Wallowa County is like. Your ignorance is so vast about those people and those places and their own internal conflicts and differences between each other. We just say, oh, those are Afghans. But within Afghanistan, how many languages you got? Or within Pakistan, and different, really significantly different cultures.
Very different.
Yeah.
Huh. Well, where did we move forward from there? So, I mean, the Nez Perce left and were kind of out of Wallowa County's picture after 1877. So how did we continue to settle in this area, and what happened after that?
Yeah, I think, that's been a really particularly interesting part of it to me, is that, of course, the Wallowa Band and, the folks that were in the Nez Perce War got sent to Oklahoma, and they were there till 85, and then the vast majority of them got shipped up to Colville in northeast Washington. very few of them got to actually go back to the Nez Perce Reservation in Lapaway. But what we forget here in Wallowa County is that, at least what I've been taught and the way I understood it was basically, after 77, that was kind of the end of the story, and there weren't Native folk coming back into the county. But what you find out is that's absolutely not the case, because both from Umatilla, the Cayuse and the Palouse and the folks that ended up on the Umatilla Reservation and the folks at Lapaway were coming back into this valley every year. They kind of took a little hiatus, as you can imagine, in 77, 78, because 77, of course, the war was going on.
Right.
And they knew it was dangerous to be off the reservation. And then 78 was the Bannock War, and that thing ended just outside of, outside of Pilot Rock. So that was also a bad time to be off the reservation. But, in the years following, there were lots of Native folk returning to Wallowa County to hunt, fish, graze, because they had the foresight to include in their treaty that they could still hunt, fish, and graze and gather roots in all their accustomed and usual places. Mm-hmm. So they were depending on that right. And, of course, the settlers complained bitterly about that over the years post 1877, trying to stop that, because when they brought in their horses and cattle, like you already said, there was conflict over that. There was competition for the resources.
Sure.
And so what you see in that post 77 period is these series of petitions coming out of Wallowa County, trying to stop that. And they hung a bunch of stuff on the Indians that they were also participating, whether it was, they blamed the disappearance of the elk and the deer on the Native folk.
Oh, really?
And they claimed that the Nez Perce and Umatilla were, bringing in diseased horses, and, so they were, and that they had caught and killed all the fish. So, in their petitions that they wrote, and there's a number of these, you can look back and see who's, whether you're a family member, if your family's been around long, did my family sign that? I could look there. Oh, there's great-granddad's name right there.
Yeah.
My great-granddad.
Right.
And then a lot of his brothers. And
yeah.
So they were coming back yearly to do that post 77. And really, that didn't start to trail off until, say, oh man, I mean, they were coming in sizable numbers until really the 30s, probably. But again,
wow,
you can see examples of this where the deputy and the sheriffs are trying to run Nez Perce folk out of the county. They're prosecuting them for game violations left and right, and even when the Forest Service got established, they started dabbling in 1899 here. And then by first part of the turn of the century, a couple of the forest rangers write an account of running the Nez Perce off of Forest Service land because, like you said, they're bringing in a bunch of cattle and a bunch of horses, and they had established grazing fees. And so they ran them off of those allotments, and so they were forced to go to places that weren't forest reserve, but were still unclaimed, like in lower, out Cold Springs Way and down into Horse Creek and some of those areas that weren't part of the Imnaha Reserve, that were off the boundaries.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So it kept, the conflict kept right on rolling, really for a long period.
Thank you all very much for listening. I'm going to keep bringing you these stories from normal people just like you who have done extraordinary things. Everyone is an expert at something, and they have interesting perspectives on life and work and the environment and all of the things that we care about. I'm going to keep bringing that to you. And I want to thank you so much for making this show possible. I also want to thank Emily Bratcher for producing this show. She does a great job editing. Really appreciate her. I want to thank John Chatelain. He did the art for the Six Ranch podcast. And Celia, soon to be Harlander, she digitized that so that we can get it out there on the internet for you. Also want to thank Justin Hay for writing this original music and the beautiful whistling that you're listening to right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much. Please keep listening to the show. Write me a review if you feel like it, and just keep doing your thing, and we'll all learn from this together. It's been fun, and we're just getting started.